Hi, this is Ashish from developerhut.net and welcome to the fifth session of Into the Spring series, which is testing the web layer in a Spring Boot application. So here we are going to see how we can create a test for a controller classes and how we can mock some of the specific part of the application like the server or the service classes. So here we will see all those annotations which are already available in a Spring Boot application like Spring Boot test, AutoWare, configure, mock MVC, mock bean, and at the rate test annotation. Now let's go ahead and start creating the application and see how we can create a test for the controller classes. So let's get started by creating very simple Spring project. So we will be creating a Maven project. Spring Boot version will be 3.3.4. Let's create the group ID. I will say com.developerhut into the Spring, right? And I will say testing web layer, okay? Or I will say Spring testing web layer. So we are going to test the web component here. Packaging will be of type jar and Java version 17 we are using. We will of course add the Spring Web dependency and that's it. This is that all we needed for now. So I will quickly generate the project. Okay, so to save some time, I have already created a very simple controller, which is home controller, and we added one method which is greet and which is returning the hello world, right? Now let's try to run this project and see if we are able to access this URL or not. So our project is started. Let's go and I will just go simply refresh this. So we're able to access the hello world, right? So our controller is definitely working fine. Now, what exactly happened over here when we started the application? So our server is started, which is in our case, which is the Tomcat server, right? And it loaded the Spring context, right? And then we are able to access this URL. Now, how we can be sure that all this is working fine or not? So whenever you are creating any Spring project, by default, Spring will add one test for us, which is available in source test Java folder with the same package name. I will just quickly correct the package name here. So if you see over here, so we have Spring testing web layer application test dot Java file, right? Which is basically have some pre-written test available. So what exactly this test is doing? So if you see this test contains one annotation which is Spring Boot test and another annotation which is test, right, from JUnit Jupyter API package. And we have one method which is empty as of now, which just says context load. Now, what exactly this Spring Boot test, right? So whenever you run this class, the Spring Boot test annotation tells Spring that to look for the main configuration class file, which is in our case this main file, right? And it will run that class and it will start the Spring context, right? And then whatever the test we have written, it will simply act accordingly, whatever the asset that you have written or whatever the condition that you have written, right? So this test basically is used to only start the Spring context, right? Let's try to run this test. So how we can run this? You can simply click on Spring project and you go to the Maven test, right? Run as Maven test. So this will basically compile your entire application and run the test, whatever the test available, right? So here, if you see, so Maven test is running whatever the test which is available, right? With the same annotation, the Spring Boot test. And once this test is completed, it will show the result as well. So here you can see the Spring context is loaded successfully, right? And there are no failures, right? If context is not loaded, then this test case will definitely fail. Okay, so this is how you can simply run the test in a Spring. So what happened behind the scene is your server is started, your context is loaded and the test is executed. Now we know that context is loaded, but how do we know whether it is loaded our controller or not, right? So how we can test this? It's very simple. So what we will do is we have a home controller, right? So let's auto wire this home controller here. I will say at the rate auto wire, which is I will say private home controller, right? And I will say simply controller, right? And we will just simply check whether this controller is this object basically is null or not, right? So how we can do that? We have assert, right? So assert that, right? And I will simply say assert what? Assert controller. And what condition that we want is not null, right? So if this fail, this test will definitely fail, right? So let's try to run this test now. So I will simply go here and I will say run as Maven test. So you can see the test is run successfully without any failure, right? Now let's do the opposite of this, right? So I will simply comment this and I will copy and paste and I will simply say is null, right? Now let's try to run this again. I will simply say run as. So here you can see the test is failed, right? Why? Because controller object is not null, right? So this is how you can simply run or execute the test and you can add assert according to your requirement. So what we did over here is we simply auto wired our home controller, right? And once context is loaded, only after that controller is created, right? And we added the test that whether this controller is null or not, right? So if it is not null, it means that our context is successfully loaded. So this is how we can simply perform some kind of a smoke test here and check whether our application is working fine or not. In case if this test is failed, it means that there is something wrong with our application, right? So this is how the Spring test you can write in the Spring application. So till now we have created a very simple test which will check the controller is created or not. Now let's create test which will actually test the controller. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's create one class. So I will say I will create new package. I will say new class and I will say home. So I will say home controller test and I will put it in controller package. I will say controller, right? Now the next thing is let's add our annotation which is at the rate spring boot test, right? So spring boot test. Let's create one method which is I will say public void I will say test default message, right? Which will testing some message from the controller and will also add at the rate test annotation, right? Now if you see here our controller is of get mapping, right? Which is returning some string which is hello world. So every time when this controller or this API is executed from this particular controller, it will return the hello world always, right? So we definitely need to assert this, right? Now how we can execute this controller and get this output and how we can assert that. Let's see that, right? So the first thing is we need to execute this API. How we can execute this? So for that we have one class which is provided by the test, which is test rest template. So let's auto add this. So I will say auto add and I will say private test rest template. Okay, which is from test web client package. I will say test rest template. Okay, now let's use this to call this API, which is home controller default API. Now I will say simply say test rest template, right? Dot get for object, right? So here, if you see, this is get mapping. That's why we use a get for object. If it's a post mapping, you can use a post for object. Okay. Now, the first parameter we need to pass here is the URL. So in our case, it is http colon slash slash localhost, right, colon 8080 and slash, or you can simply provide 8080 as well, both will work, right? And next is, what is the output that we are getting? So output type is definitely a string here, right? So let's add string dot class. So this is what we are getting from this URL, right? Let's take this in variable, and I will say response, right? And let's add assert accordingly. So I will say assert that, right? Assert what exactly? It is response. And I will say response, what it should contains the hello world. So I will simply go here and I will simply copy this. I will say hello world and I will put it here, right? Let's save this. Now let's try to execute this. So I will simply run as and run as a JUnit test. So our application is started, test is started, but test is failed, right? So now let's see what it is saying. It is saying no qualifying bean of type test rest template, right? So this dependency which we have added, which is a test rest template, is not auto-wired here. So how we can resolve this? You simply need to add some parameter in the Spring Boot test, right? So if you see here, we have a port which is 8080, which is a defined port, right, for this application. So you can simply say here we have one parameter which is web environment, right? So I will say web environment is what? So it is web environment dot defined port. Okay. So there are multiple parameters here. You can use a mock, you can use none, or you can use a random port. So random port in case if you don't know the port. Now we know the port, so that's why we are using the defined port. Now let's try to run this again. So I will simply say run as a JUnit test, and let's see if it works. Yeah. So here, if you see, so our test runs successfully, right? And here the output is success, right? So we are getting hello world. If you change the message either in a test, let's say, or in actual, application. So let's say I will add something, I will save this. And now if you run this test, definitely this test is going to fail, right? So this is how testing will protect your application, right? So you know that someone else wrote this test cases, he know that output should be hello world. And now by mistake, in the future, you change this application. If you run this, it will definitely get failed. So now here the test is little bit not a correct because you add a contains here, right? So this is not contain. Let's say if I completely change this, right? I say user, and now let's try to run this again. So this should fail because it is not containing the hello world, right? Your string is not definitely have this hello world. Okay. So this is how we can simply execute your test cases and run the test cases. So what we have did is we have created the controller test case, which will actually test the controller, right? I will simply revert this, and yeah, let me save this. So in this case, if you see over here, your act server is started, right, which is Tomcat, and your Spring context is loaded, right? Now let's create some more test cases which will not start any of your server. It will only load the Spring context and it will run the test. Okay, let's see how we can achieve that in the next section. Now let's create a test case which will actually mock your server. We will only load the Spring context and we will test our controller, right? So I will simply go here and I will say new. I will say class. I will say home controller, I will say mock test. Let's say finish. And the first thing, of course, we required our annotation, which is at the rate Spring Boot test, right? Now, next is I will simply just copy the test which we wrote earlier. I will simply copy it and I will paste it over here, right? Now we are not going to use the REST template over here because we are mocking the server. So the test REST template will required only when you are using the server because it works on the actual URL, right? So if you see here, we have HTTP localhost 8080. This will only work in case where your server is started on some particular port, right? Here in this case, we are not using the server, so we are mocking this. So how we can do this? So for this, instead of a test REST template, we will use a mock MVC. Okay, so I will say auto wired and I will say private. I will say mock MVC. So this is the class which will require. I will say mock MVC, right? And we will use this. So I will say mock MVC dot perform method. We will of course using this, right? Now this will require the request builder. We will see how we can create this. So we use here instead of this, right? So we have get method, right, which will return this mock HTTP servlet request builder, right, which will only take the URL. This is not the URL, this is the URL. So in our case, what exactly our URL is, it is only slash, right? So I will simply add it over here, a slash, right? So basically this perform method will execute this API, right? And it will get the result. Now, what you want to do with this result, that is something very interesting, right? So here you can, we will use here the method chaining. So I will say dot and return. Okay, so it will return the MVC result and we will get whatever the response that we require. And we will convert this response to string, right? So I will say get content as string, right? So this is very simple, right? So I will simply extract this to variable and I will say the response, right? Now we have the response back and we will assert this response with the hello world. So this is giving compile time error because we need to add the throws exception, right? So I will add unsupported encoding exception and the exception and the throws clause, right? So let's save this. Let's try to run this and let's see if it's working or not. I will say run as JUnit test and it is starting the Spring context. It is failed. Let's see what exactly the error is. So it is saying no qualifying bean of type mock MVC, right? So of course we required one annotation for this. What are the mock MVC we auto add or which we try to inject here? It is not yet injected properly. So for that we required one annotation which is auto configure mock MVC. So I will say at the rate auto configure. Okay, let's save this and let's try to run this now. So our test run successfully, right? So we got the hello world and we are able to execute this test case. Now, if you see over here on a console, if you see here the Spring context is loaded. However, you don't see anything related to the Tomcat, right? Or not even a port, right? So this is how we are mocking the entire server, right? Here only Spring context is loaded. Once Spring context is loaded, it will load all the controller classes and then you can perform a test on it. However, in our earlier test, the server is started, then context is loaded, and then you ran the test, right? In this case, we mock the complete server, right? So if you don't want to start the Tomcat server or whatever the server that you are using, you can simply use the mock MVC. You just add the auto configure mock MVC and use this mock MVC class to execute your APIs and perform test on this. So as of now, we have created a test which is testing the controller without starting the server, where we mock the entire server. We only load the Spring context and then we are testing the controller. Now, let's say if we have a controller which is dependent on the service classes, which are basically executing some of the business logic, right? So I have created some controller, right? So we have a controller with say hello, which will take the username from the hello service, right? Which is basically taking the username from the database. For now, we have only hard coded the username part, right? Now, whatever the username that we are getting from the service, we are appending the hello and then we are sending it back as a response to this controller, right? Now, let's say we don't want to execute the service part, right? Here we want to mock this part because this part may contain some of the database logic where we don't want to execute this logic while running the test case, right? That's why we want this service to be mocked while test is executing, right? So let's write a test for this, right? So I will go here and I will say new and I will say class. I will say hello controller test, right? And let's say click finish. Now, the first thing which we need to add over here is we need to add some other annotation. So earlier we used the Spring Boot test. Now we want to mock some of the part of the controller, right? So for that we are using other annotation which is web MVC test. Okay, so this is the annotation which we need to use and we need to tell that what kind of a controller that we are going to test with this test service. So I will say controllers, right? And I will say hello controller dot class. Okay. So now we want to execute this hello controller, get the response, and then we will assert that response, right? So for this, I will simply copy the content from here, right? We will definitely require the mock MVC, right? I will just copy and paste to save some time, right? So we have a mock MVC, right? And here we need to call the say hello API, right? So we'll update this and we say and return get response. This part will be same and we will instead of this, right? What we are getting over here is we are getting the John Doe, right? So I will just copy this and we'll assert this, right? Instead of this because this is our actual response which we will get from this API, right? Now let's try to run this class and see if it works. So I will say run as and JUnit, right? Now we are getting some error. Let's see what it is. So we are again getting the same error, which is no such bean, which is saying no qualifying bean of type hello service, right? Now here your context is loaded, but this bean is not yet created, right? So we want to mock this hello service, right? We don't want to execute this during our test execution, right? So how we can mock this? So we will use annotation, which is mock bean, right? Mock bean, and I will say private hello service, right? And I will say hello service. Okay. Once you add the mock bean, it will simply create the mock class of this particular service. So what exactly the mock here is? Mock is nothing but the dummy implementation of this particular class or any other class which will you use. So you can only mock particular classes. You won't mock any of the classes. We will see this in more detail in my upcoming video, right? So now once you define this class as a mock, you can use this. Now let's see if it works. So I will go here and I will run as a JUnit test. Now my Spring context is loaded. Let's see if it works. So test is still failing, right? So if you see here, we are expecting the hello John Doe, right? But we are getting hello null, right? So it means that whatever the response we got from this method is null, right? Even if you try to debug this, you will definitely get a null because you haven't mentioned over here what needs to be done on this particular mock service when this method is executed, right? So this is something we need to tell to our test, because this is a mock object, right? A mock object don't know. So if you don't write anything in the mocking method call, it will always return a null value, right? So now how we can mock this? So this means we will use when, right? So you just need to type a when, which is from org Mockito framework, right? So this is a method. So when, right? When what you need to do, right? So basically you need to tell what is the operation which is going to execute. So my operation will be hello service dot get user name from DB, right? So this means that when this particular method is executed, right? Then what we need to do, right? Then you can simply write then return, right? And return what? Whatever that you want, right? So I just want to return John Doe, right? So I will simply write John Doe here, right? And I will just save this. So this is simply very simple, right? If you see over here, our get username from database method is returning the string, right? And while mocking, you are saying this, whenever this method is executed, please return John Doe. Okay. Now let's see. I will say run as and run as JUnit. Our Spring context is loaded, and yeah. So here you see your test is passed successfully, right? Now here we mock this entire class, right? And our main purpose to test this is whether our string contains hello or not. We doesn't care about what is coming from this hello service class, right? So this is the objective of this test case. So let's say if you update the username over here, right? Let's say I will say Jessica, right? And you can update here as well, right? And just try to run this and this will still work, right? So whatever the output that you want from that particular mock object, you can update it accordingly. We are not dependent on the service classes, right? Because our main objective here is to test the controller functionality, not the hello service, right? Whenever you are creating the test for hello service, you are only focusing on the hello service method implementation, not on the dependent other classes. So this is the motto, and mocking, which we use over here, is very, very beneficial while writing the test case, because it will reduce lot of code, right? Manual code, and we do not require database connection, or you can even mock any of the URL response and anything that whatever you want, right? So there are lots of mocking methods. There are a lot of frameworks available. There are a lot of methods available. I will keep updating those information with upcoming video session, right? So here, this is how we can simply mock the service. So I hope you understand how we can create a test for the controller classes by mocking the specific part of the application. So all the source code which I demonstrated in this video session is available on my GitHub repository, and link is available in the description section below. If you have any question, please do add your question in the comment section below. And if you think this information is valuable, please do like, share and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.